Hello there, very warm welcome to this latest edition of Talking Europe on France 24. Now today we're talking about something we all like to indulge in sometimes, complaints. The European Union is the focus of literally thousands of official ones every year, and today we're meeting the woman who deals with pretty much every single one of them. Emily O'Reilly is the EU's Ombudsman, a former journalist who hails from Ireland and who won awards for her reporting before delving into the world of the European institutions. Emily O'Reilly, thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you, a pleasure, thank you.
Well, first question really, from here in the European Parliament, where I think most of our viewers know what goes on here. Not many of our viewers perhaps know what the EU Ombudsman is. Can you enlighten us?
Well, yeah, the EU Ombudsman was created out of the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s, so that created the idea of the European citizen. So just as most citizens in every member state can complain about their administration to a member state ombudsman, so too can EU citizens complain about the EU institutions to me. So we get loads of complaints, several thousand every year, not all within my mandate, because most of them still pertain to the mandate, to the competence of the member state. So they can range from anything. I wrote to the Commission, they didn't respond to me. I had a contract to do such and such a piece of business or provide a service to an institution. I've run into problems, can you help me? We get lots of questions about freedom of information requests. We get questions about the revolving doors practices, officials within the EU institutions going to the private sector, conflicts of interest, fundamental rights questions, so a wide variety of questions that we deal with. But it's important that the complaint has to be against a European institution.
Right. Okay, so not just I'm unhappy with the state of my roads in my hometown.
Yes, or I don't like European politics. I don't deal with that either.
Okay, or I don't like the flag or something.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll come on to the type of complaints you get in just a minute. Just one sort of point of semantics, really. Obviously, we talk about the Ombudsman. Do you say Ombudsman or Ombudswoman? It's the kind of debate that we have nowadays.
Well, it absolutely is. And when I became Ombudsman in Ireland in 2003, it was the first question I was asked, was I going to be called Ombudsman or Ombudswoman? So I said, well, I'll answer to either. And immediately the Swedish community in Ireland contacted me and said that, I didn't understand the language, because Ombudsman is meant to be a general description, generic of somebody who, an intermediary there on behalf of the people. So I've kept Ombudsman, but I think increasingly I'm more prone to call myself an ombudswoman, and certainly I don't react negatively if somebody calls me that. And of course, in other languages, in French it's mediatrice, in Spanish it's defensora del pueblo, so they feminize it. So perhaps there is an argument for feminizing it in the EU law as well.
Now, I know that when you were elected to the office of EU Ombudsman or Ombudswoman, you said that the EU had to become the gold standard in ethics, transparency, accountability and effectiveness. Now, the figures are out for 2017. The number of complaints actually went up. Is that a bad sign?
No, I don't think so. It's not a sign, an indication that the EU administration is getting worse. What I think it is a sign of is that I think my office is attracting increasing visibility, and not because that many people know more people know about it, but rather that I think we're looking strategically at a lot of cases that have a very strong public interest element. The transparency of trade negotiations, for example. We're looking at Brexit insofar as one can look at it at the moment until I suppose more serious talking begins. It's not just that we're getting more complaints, but we're getting, in a sense, better complaints that have a very strong public interest element in them, and therefore if I solve them, they can help millions of people, even if they don't actually know that the office exists.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty of those complaints then. The number one complaint area last year was transparency. Several fairly high-profile cases pertaining to that. The first one I wanted to talk about was what's known as Selmayr Gate. We've reported about it on France 24. Martin Selmayr, there's a rapid promotion to become the lead civil servant in the European Commission. It seemed that even the vice presidents of the Commission weren't aware that it was happening until it happened. You have recently opened an inquiry into this. Could Martin Selmayr's appointment to that job actually be cancelled in the end?
Well, that would not be down to me. We got a complaint from two groupings of MEPs, one from the Netherlands and another group from France, I think. And I think people were aware there was a lot of concern about the appointment. It seemed to be done very quickly. The Parliament, questions the procedures and so on. At the moment, we're looking at the complaint. And one of the powers that I have that the Parliament actually doesn't have is that I can see the records. I have the right to see whatever records I need to make a fair assessment in the case. My colleagues will be going to the Commission and they will be looking at all relevant records, whether they're emails or whatever. And after that, I'll analyse it and look at the law and look at the principles that should apply, and then make recommendations if I judge that to be necessary.
And the recommendations that you make, they're not necessarily followed, are they? There's no obligation for them to actually be carried out?
In a way, sometimes people ask Ombudsman if they want sort of hard powers, if they want the power to make binding decisions, and that's not the way the Ombudsman works. I mean, you're a mediator. You're trying to affect solutions that, well, they may not necessarily satisfy both sides, but they are above all fair and they're above all just. And I think if I was making binding decisions, then we just simply end up in courts, and that's not what we want. But in any given year, between 80 and 90% of the recommendations are accepted. Now, sometimes Ombudsmen say we get 100% recommendations accepted, and that must be a good thing. But if you set the bar too low, it's not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes recommendations are challenging, and you don't always get them accepted. But I think what you are as well, you're an influencer, that even, just the mere fact of raising an issue, drawing public attention to it, can be sufficient to change things. Maybe not immediately, but certainly over time.
Well, let's talk about a case, another recent one, where the recommendations you made were not followed. This pertains to Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank. There were complaints about the fact that he's a member of a think tank based in Washington, and people concerned about conflicts of interest. Can you just tell us about that and, well, the outcome? You made recommendations that he declined.
Yeah, well, this is a case in point in terms of influencing culture. Maybe not winning the battle, but perhaps or winning the war eventually. Mario Draghi, as you know, is the president of the ECB, which is a very, very powerful role, and a more powerful role ever since the financial crisis, when they gave it additional powers in terms of supervising banks and so on. We got a complaint saying that Mr. Draghi's membership of a private think tank based in Washington, the G30, the Group of 30, which comprises some central bankers, a lot of people from some of the big banks, Goldman Sachs, all of that. They made the claim that his membership of this grouping was incompatible with his role as the head of an independent bank. We looked at that and we formed the view that it was incompatible, that Mr. Draghi, that the ECB as a supervisor should not be within a private club. We should not be in a private club, some of whose members belong to some of the banks that are directly or indirectly supervised by the ECB. We simply thought that was wrong. Mr. Draghi and the ECB disagreed. What we had asked was that Mr. Draghi suspend his membership until he is due to step down anyway at the end of 2019. And this was in line with global practice, because Janet Yellen, who had been head of the Federal Reserve, which is, I suppose, the US equivalent of the ECB, she had been a member of the G30 when she was involved in private banks. When she became vice chair and then chair of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve, she resigned from the G30. She stepped down from her membership. Then when she stepped down from the Fed a few months ago, she rejoined the G30 within a few days. But that showed that she recognised that there was a difficulty there in relation to the perception of independence. So I was disappointed about that, but I'm happy that the issue has been raised.
Right, well, I look ahead to how your recommendations could end up having an impact in the future then. I'd like to move on to a completely different subject, something that's been very much in the news recently. As I mentioned, you yourself are from Ireland. Ireland very much in the headlines with the referendum on abortion liberalisation. Now, as we know, Irish voters backed liberalisation of abortion laws by a 2/3 majority. Were you surprised by the scale of that result?
Yes, I was, and I think everybody was, because the opinion polls hadn't really shown it. They always did show that the yes vote to remove essentially the constitutional ban on abortion would win, but it was narrow, and a lot of people felt that even the no side could win, and that there were a lot of silent no voters. But in fact, what we discovered was that there were a lot of silent yes voters.
There seemed to be a lot of young women who...
Well, yeah, that was incredible, and I mean, the young people really were to the fore in this campaign, and it was very... interesting and moving as well to see so many young people, because so many Irish young people are scattered all around the world, you know, living on other continents, coming home to vote, and not always voting yes, but voting no as well. But it was very powerful, and it showed the power of the young, the power of activism, but it also showed obviously how much Ireland has changed, because just a few years ago, of course, we passed the marriage equality, gay marriage essentially, in Ireland. So I think people's vision of Ireland as being very conservative and very Catholic has been completely turned on its head.
Indeed, within the space of a generation. We've actually got a report where we can look back a bit on the history behind the recent referendum in Ireland. This is from our reporter Clément Bonneroux.
No social issue has divided Ireland as sharply as abortion in recent decades. To understand why, you have to go back to 1983, when the country voted to insert an anti-abortion clause into its constitution. The so-called Eighth Amendment recognised an equal right to life for both the mother and her unborn child, effectively prohibiting abortion. Several high-profile cases, however, led to calls for liberalisation. In 1992, a teenage rape victim who was suffering from suicidal thoughts was prevented by the courts from terminating her pregnancy in England in what became known as the X case. The ruling was later overturned by Ireland's Supreme Court, judges saying that a realistic threat of suicide constituted acceptable grounds for an abortion. 3 referendums were then held, and the constitution was amended to allow Irish women to travel abroad to seek terminations. Since 1992, some 3,000 women have travelled to the UK for a procedure every year.
All I was thinking on the flight was, how many women are on this flight travelling to get an abortion? And when we got into the clinic, sure enough, there was one girl in the clinic that was on our flight.
The abortion debate returned to the fore in 2012 when Savita Halappanavar died in hospital after being denied an abortion during a miscarriage. Her death prompted outrage, with some 2,000 protesters gathering outside the Irish Parliament. Legislation was amended a year later to allow terminations under certain conditions. That is, if the woman's life is at risk, either from a medical condition or from suicidal thoughts. International organisations have also played a key role in moving the debate forward. Ruling on 2 separate cases, the European Court of Human Rights and the UN's Human Rights Committee expressed concern over Ireland's restrictive abortion laws. The UN even accusing Ireland in 2016 of cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment for forcing women to travel abroad to get an abortion. It was only in 2017 that the government promised to hold a referendum on whether to legalise terminations, paving the way for a historic overhaul of Ireland's abortion laws.
Now, Emily O'Reilly, I know that you actually wrote a book about how the conservative Catholic right in Ireland influenced the 1983 referendum we were just hearing about. Of course, things have changed a lot in the Republic of Ireland, but there's a bit of an anomaly now with Northern Ireland as part of the UK, but abortion still unavailable to women there. Do you see that change in Northern Ireland is perhaps inevitable now?
Well, it is available in certain circumstances, but many women still have to travel. Well, I don't know whether it's inevitable, but certainly pressure is coming on. And it's very interesting because this is becoming actually part of the Brexit debate. Why? Because the Democratic Unionist Party, the party which is supporting the Conservative Party in Westminster, would be against liberalisation of the abortion regime. And, you know, if Madam May comes under pressure to change it, you can see how that can be problematic.
Sticking with the theme of women's rights, I know that you're known as quite an advocate of women in public life, in public office and high office, in fact. Now, in the EU, we do still have a large majority of male heads of state and government, same as all around the world, in fact. Is that such a bad thing in itself?
Oh, well, no, I think you have to have the female voice. I think that changes the conversation. I mean, even it was when, during the abortion debate in Ireland, it was noticed that the committee that dealt with it and that made recommendations, it had a majority of women in it, and that changed the nature of the debate. So I think even for everybody's sake, men as well as women's, I think you have to have that female voice so we can get the full human experience when we are considering the laws that we make.
I know that there's a push from some of the groups here in the Parliament to have more women standing in next year's elections. But it's difficult, isn't it? You're a mother of 5 children yourself, if I might mention that. It is difficult for women. There are things inbuilt into society and how these jobs work, aren't there?
Oh yeah, it is, obviously. I mean, obviously there's greater equality now, and certainly within the EU institutions and many civil services, the family-friendly policies enable women to, you know, to juggle both. But it's not just, I think, the physical aspect of it, you know, the women doing sometimes more tasks in relation to childcaring as well. It's also the emotional piece, you know. I mean, I never come here without my children. They're actually not physically here, but they're always here in my head. You know, whereas I think men perhaps find it easier to compartmentalize them. That's not to say that they're worse parents. It's just the way we are biologically. But I think the flexibility is the key to it. When people ask me, how do you manage 5 children in a career and all of that? Well, I was in journalism. I was a print journalist. And quite honestly, for most of the time, my editors didn't care where I worked or when I worked or whether I was breastfeeding at the time or whatever, or even giving birth, as long as I produce copy. So that gives you an enormous amount of flexibility. Whereas you're in a job, it's sort of old-fashioned, rigid, you know, ways of thinking about how you work. It has to be 9 to 5. You have to be present. You can get an hour for lunch or whatever. That makes it very difficult. Now, it is changing, but we have to be careful to not to change it in a way that allows so much flexibility or encourages women to take so much time out without making sure that that does not prevent them from continuing to climb the career ladder, and that they are not, in a sense, disenfranchised or disempowered or prevented from progressing simply because they have taken time out to look after their children or to take maternity leave or whatever.
Well, perhaps change is on its way. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Emily O'Reilly, the EU's Ombudsman or Ombudswoman. You can take your pick. Thank you very much for watching our show. We'll see you soon for more Europe news here on France 24.